días. Muchas gracias por asistir. Sean ustedes bienvenidos a la charla Regulaciones de la Comunidad Europea de Asia en el uso de pesticidas para cítricos. Esta charla tiene una duración aproximada de 1 hora y media, ¿sí? Les pedimos por favor que sea una ocasión para poder absolver preguntas, dudas en relación a este importante tema que nos compete a todos como exportadores. Y bueno, en esta oportunidad contamos con una expositora experta y en este momento cedo la palabra a nuestro gerente técnico, el ingeniero Enzo Lucchetti, para la presentación respectiva.
Buenos días a todos ustedes, realmente les agradecemos su presencia, que estén acá. Un poco contarles esto, como parte de las capacitaciones que está realizando Prociclos durante el año, hemos decidido tocar este tema de las regulaciones, aprovechando también el evento que hemos tenido de Global. Lindi es sudafricana, es entomóloga, es microbióloga, es experta en acceso al mercado, directora de la Oficina Comercial y de Acceso al Mercado para la Asociación Sudafricana de Manzana, Pera, Frutales de Hueso y Vid. Tiene 20 años de experiencia en el tema de regulaciones y es miembro permanente del SAP, Asociación de Productores de Fruta Fresca del Hemisferio Sur. Es una persona con mucha experiencia en el tema, en la cual nosotros podemos contar con su apoyo, con su ayuda en este momento y espero que hagan todas las consultas del caso. Bueno, yo doy por aperturado el evento y los dejo todos ustedes con Lindi.
Un fuerte aplauso a Lindi.
Un fuerte aplauso.
Bienvenida. La presentación va a ser en inglés, hay un traductor simultáneo. Por favor, aquellos que lo prefieran pueden contar con el audífono para poder seguir la conferencia.
Traveled your beautiful country before with a mochilo in South America for 1 year, many years ago. So,
Lindi, maybe.
okay. He's now made it go away again. Sorry, technology. I'm very aware of your beautiful country. I'm sorry I didn't have time this time to do it. So ProCitrus asked me to do a presentation. It's a little bit difficult because I don't know the target audience. So I hope that the issues that I touch on and discuss will be of interest to you. It's quite difficult for me to know if I'm going too fast. So if you think I'm speaking too fast or going too fast, please just stop me. Hola. Okay. Okay. So thank you for giving the overview of my background. And my first few slides will actually also give you a bit of more information about what my core portfolio is. So I'm going to try and give you an overview on the key trade market access objectives. And focusing on critical chemical risk management and the coordination issues, because Sergio told me that would be the main focus. But I will make reference to phytosanitary issues as well, because all of those issues depend also on chemicals. So if we talk about market access actions, it's an awareness of international requirements, the trade barriers that we all know, and the protocols that influence sustained industry. We all want to be sustainable, and that means I'm looking at market access and international trade, but it also means, together with other people in my industry, that we are looking at related technology transfer. Research is very important, and training, because for many of these issues, if you don't proactively look at those things, you will lose your market. So the main overall objective is to reduce industry business risk by enhancing technical, science-based market access related activities in sync or together with trade policy, commercial priorities and requirements. And the key objectives in that environment is maintaining current market access by ensuring that we meet sanitary, phytosanitary requirements, providing, in my case, support to our Department of Agriculture, who is the National Plant Protection Organization for South Africa, and I'm sure you need to do the same for your export markets to your phytosanitary markets, so that we can ensure opening of new markets and maintaining existing markets. And the maintaining existing markets is the one that's becoming more challenging, and I'll try and touch on that one issue a bit later. It's also important to remain abreast of international sanitary, the food safety, regulatory and non-regulatory developments and trends in the key global markets. And we all know if you export to EU, the non-regulatory standards for chemicals can be a big problem. It's important to proactively manage the risk related to the plant protection product use, the PPPs. If you do global gap, you know we refer to PPPs. And also to look at the loss and withdrawal of the critical key plant protection products in these global markets. And I hope that by the end of today that I can show you what we do, and maybe you can share with me how you do it. And then finally is to stay abreast and advise the industry on ongoing changing legislation, particularly when it comes to the MRLs, the maximum residue levels. So the key objectives would be to provide, in my case, the deciduous fruit industry with updated maximum residue information, the MRL. If I refer to MRL, they know what I'm talking about. MRL. And within my environment, I have a crop protection advisory group, we refer to it as a CPAG, which is a group of experts that sits under my portfolio. They're very strong technically, and we often strategize around some of these difficult, challenging issues, and in some cases have to put processes in place so that we can still maintain access to our markets. This CPAG is under Hortgro, which is my main body, but the parties that are on it are from different places in the industry. It's also important to proactively initiate what we call breakdown residue trials to address critical chemical actives, particularly with regard to chemicals that we know we might be losing, but which we still need. Then we will invest in doing breakdown residue trials to see if the MRL goes down, can we still meet the requirement? It's also important to facilitate development of plant protection products and also alternate control strategies as required by industry. We've done a lot of biological work, or what you might be calling biorational these days, and I'll touch on that at the end as well. So not only chemicals, looking at other ways to control, not using residues. Facilitating collective industry initiatives to negotiate market-driven, non-regulatory plant protection MRL demands that threaten the sustainability of these actives. I'm sure that in many cases, if you're exporting to the EU, particularly Germany, you are aware of some of these challenges. A third of the EU MRL, or maximum of 3 or 5 actives. And that all makes you not be able to use IPM properly as well. So these are all challenges. And then also facilitating collective industry initiatives to negotiate market-driven, to facilitate and initiate relevant research regarding changing application of existing plant protection products and development of possible alternative control programs. I don't necessarily do it, but I'm involved in facilitating. We have a whole structure under Hortgro Science that has various different programs that work, soil health programs, crop protection programs, pathology programs, and then we have research that's ongoing to address our critical needs. And then one of the important issues for me as well is also engagement with our government with the Registrar of Act 36, which is the party that is responsible for South Africa to register chemicals, because we have had many situations already where we needed to get emergency registrations, and having that strong network with the government helps, and also then with the agrochemical industry. And in some cases, that's also about getting registrations in place, but also in my capacity as an expert, we have some smaller grower associations, blueberries, cherries, also under our portfolio to try and get registration of what we call minor crop registrations, because they have no registration, so to try and get companies to register. So, So just so that you are aware, for us, one of my functions that we've been doing since 2000, 2001, we maintain on our website a database which is updated 3 times a year. The first version is in July of every year, before our season. We've just had the second version of October, and we usually do our third version in December. So we update all the MRL information for our industry on the website. I'm sorry you can't see too well, but in our case, for instance, we have MRL documents that cover all our fruit types. So it would be, in our case, all the stone fruit, apricots, peaches, nectarines, plums, pears, apples, and we have 2 levels of information. One of the levels is we have the active, which you know. We have because when you're looking at residues, it's never about the actual trade name. You're always looking at the active ingredient. And we would then have on this information, we also have a default MRL, which is, it's very small, but in South Africa, I'm not sure what it is like here in Peru, but if our South African MRL is lower, then we must work to South African one. If the EU MRL is lower, we work to the EU. Otherwise, we're not being legally compliant with South African legislation. So we have the various things, and then we also have the last column where we call MRL, we flag if there are some countries that are lower than what we're working at, we flag it in that last column. You know what flag is? So we warn the people that be aware those countries have lower than what we are using. This is the next level of information where for each fruit type, depending on which countries we're exporting to, we have all the different countries. You can see some countries have very few MRLs, including China. Some of them use codex if they don't have their own MRLs, and so I'll show you what we also have on our website. What we also do is, as we're going through the presentation today, you will see some of the chemicals coming under pressure. And just for example, this one, eprodion, because it's genotoxic, mutagenic, all of those products for the future, the EU is going to kick it out. So we already started warning our industry on the website, because it's a post-harvest chemical, the season before, problem is coming. Because if you use it and the MRL drops, maybe it will be a problem. We also warn in the EU column by watching all the legislation. If we see there's a draft legislation like we have now, eprodion, there's a draft regulation which will drop the MRL down to the LOD, the limit of detection, which is 0.01. So you can see some of those MRLs are now 5 or 3. If you don't know about it, you can have a problem. Also part of the information, we have what we call the special notes page, which gives details about various things on the information. And we also have then for each country what the source is, but we also indicate then if a country will accept codex or not accept codex MRLs if they don't have one for them for their own. Not all countries, you know, some of them are very clear. We know, for instance, Taiwan won't accept codex. But most, Singapore, Malaysia, most of them, if there isn't an MRL, you can use the codex MRL. So we try and indicate that on the website as well. So basically, this is our MRL information that we then update 3 times a year. The next one will be December. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the phytosanitary, but another part of my portfolio is when it comes to getting access to new markets and maintaining access to existing markets, particularly the phytosanitary markets. We have to develop the PIPs, or the phytosanitary information packages, for each of the crops that needs to be submitted to the country you want to export to for new market access. And we have to draft the gaps, the good agricultural practices for the different pests and diseases. We have to provide input to what we call PRAs, the pest risk assessments, which is a process you have to go through to get access. We are 15 and a half years trying to get pears into China. It took 30 years for table grapes to Japan, and that was for one cultivar only. I'm sure you also have the same problem. But under this, you can see I also have, under my portfolio, I have a retired entomologist professor, and I have a doctorate pathologist and an entomologist, and because it takes that much inputs to all of these things. In fact, we end up doing a lot of the government's work as industry experts. It's not only important for exports, it's as important for imports, because we don't want, when products are imported into South Africa, that diseases come in that we do not have, like Lobesia or Drosophila Suzuki. We don't have them, so we have to make inputs for the imports as well. And then in my portfolio, we have certain government industry meetings that we have every 6 weeks for driving the market access process and the imports on the phytosanitary side. And then it's also as important at an international level to develop networks locally. So for instance, internationally, we are all members of SHAFE, Southern Hemisphere Exporters Forum. Sergio was the president, chairman for 3-4 years. So we all engage as well to try and address some of these challenges together. And one thing that we are not that strong in South Africa, which a lot of the other countries are stronger at, is having trade agreements. Part of that is because we as South Africa have to be part of other African countries. It's not so straightforward to get all of them to work together. So that is one area that we are weak. So I'm not going to go into detail, but just so you can see, we have access for table grapes to China and for apples. We're waiting. Pears, last night, I got from the new GAC, what used to be AXIC for China, which is now called GAC. We got via our government after 15 and a half years. Now maybe we're going to start looking at finalizing for pears to get access. So that's very good news for my industry. Israel table grapes, USA table grapes, Pome and Stone, Taiwan apples, and for Taiwan apples, more or less a year and a half, our industry was suspended because after 30 years of exporting to Taiwan, they found one single codling moth larvae in Taiwan, and they stopped all our exports. So you understand what cost that was to our industry. We had to put all sorts of measures in place. We had to put a self-regulatory system in place. We finally got access again in May last year, but it was a big one for us. Japan, Barlinka grapes, but for one cultivar only. We're still trying to get other cultivars. We don't even grow Barlinka anymore. They've pulled all the Barlinka out. So we don't even, after 30 years of trying to access. Mexico, table grapes, Thailand, table grapes, and we're trying to get access for the others. And since last year, and that's what I want to warn, is that the EU is becoming very much stricter on plant health issues. And for us, the regulation that came in place last year for Thamnotica leucotricha, which is an endemic lepidopteran, for prunus, we had to put measures in place. And I'm going to flag one new regulation which is coming for non-European tephritid fruit fly, which may even affect Peru going forward. And it's important to know these things because you have to provide what your system will be, if it's going to be cold treatment, systems approach, etc. And all of them are reliant on effective toolbox with chemicals. Okay, so if we're talking about the EU, Sergio said to me that the EU is one of the focus areas for the citrus industry. If we're looking at the more statutory requirements, the phytosanitary is becoming more important, but over the last few years, food safety and the EU General Food Law, European Commission or EC 178, and in the UK, the Food Safety Act of 1990 has driven a lot of the food safety requirements. And then previously, EC 91414 was the one that was responsible for registration or authorization of chemicals in the EU. That's now been replaced by the 1107. And when I show you further in the presentation, you'll see that's also the one that's causing a lot of problems for us going forward, where a lot of chemicals are not being authorized in the EU and they're being withdrawn. And that's going to be the new big area for us to have a problem. And then obviously the 396 legislation, which brought in harmonization of the EU MRLs from 2008, which supposedly made it easier, but we're also having issues around there, especially on the revision of all of these chemicals. And then the other side of the EU is the non-regulatory or the private standard or the retailer requirements, which can be sometimes more problematic than the official. Those are just some of the ones. So I mentioned that the 396 was the one that harmonized the MRLs many years ago. There are 4 directives. The main one that talks to the MRLs is Annex 2. And then someone, I think, asked me the other day, what about biologicals? Even the biologicals and what they call the basic substances, like garlic oil, they all have to also be authorized. So sometimes you will see it will have a maximum default MRL of 0.01, and you won't find the things, but they still require it. And Annex 4 would be those products which do not need MRLs. So the garlic oils, the biologicals, and that became applicable from September 2008. Now, at more or less the same time, the European Parliament started playing a bigger role in all the EU process. And because they are the greener of the green, they also make things more difficult. So the key legislation for pesticides in the EU, if you talk about authorization, the EU talks about authorization or approval, or what we maybe call sometimes registration. So in other words, the placing of them on the market, that regulation is to do with 1107/2009, and you'll see that comes up a lot in the stuff that I'm going to show you later. As chemicals come up for re-registration or reauthorization, for certain reasons, if they don't meet the criteria, they can be withdrawn. The other one that's more relevant, so in this case, the European Commission and the member states, there are 28 EU member states are involved in this process. There are EU standing committees, etc. The sustainable use one, which affects us less, but it does have certain things that might start driving the process, like they want IPM or whatever. That's mainly the member states that manage that issue. They have certain cut-off dates for certain, like I think 2018 they had to have plans in place for all of their actions, national action plans for IPM, etc. But I'm not going to talk about that because it's more member state. And then obviously the residues or the MRL issues is to do with the 396, and that's mainly the EU Commission. So this regulation 396, it was implemented, but they were still bringing in certain things ongoing, and one of those is the cumulative risk assessment. So where you talk about multiple residues, the cocktail type things, that was an issue that they still were working on. And then the ongoing issue is the Article 12, the revision of MRLs. And you'll see, I won't go into detail, but this process is having a lot of effect on us losing the MRLs, or the MRLs being reduced going forward. Now for us, the key issue for that is if substances of concern have any toxicological endpoints that don't have data, like for us, ethapon. It also was one of the ones where the acute reference dose exceedance was a problem. That triggers a problem. So I'm not going to go into detail, but just so you can see, because ethapon, and this is what I would refer to as the MRL case study, so the residue one. Because with ethapon, the MRL review, it triggered concerns for consumer safety and also exceedance of the ARFD. We still have a problem with this one. That right away threw it into the bag of we don't want it. Some of the private parties still don't want it, and it's a very critical one for us for table grapes. So we followed it. I'm not going to go into detail, but we followed all the legislation to ensure it's very important that you follow this legislation if you want to try and see how you can sustain that chemical. We also did, in the industry, we did what I referred to earlier on, breakdown residue trials to see if the MRL went down, could we still use it and comply to the EU MRL because it was an important one. And just like ethapon, azanthos methyl is another one that went the same way, and where that was important for us because with something like codling moth, when you want to bring the threshold of the pest down, you want to use that, and then you can use the other chemistries. And if you're going to Germany, you sometimes need that type of chemical which won't be picked up if you're not allowed another residue because of the 3 or 4 residues. So we also did breakdown residue work, but we do have some alternatives there now. Then the other one we talk about, I talked just now about the 1107 and the non-inclusion or the non-authorization. You will see many of the chemicals coming up now are not being authorized again. And if they're not being authorized, they get withdrawn for EU use. And some of the private parties like to say it's been banned. It hasn't been banned, it's been it's not withdrawn for EU use, but it starts making problems for us that are exporting there. Now, DPA is used, it's a SCALT product. It's used, mainly to ensure a long-term storage quality of apples. Otherwise, you get oxidization. The apple goes black, especially with Granny Smith. So it was quite an important one. But once again, why did it trigger it? Because they found certain, they identified certain metabolites, which they called nitrosamines, which they said was a problem, and so that's why we've lost this active after the process. So we as an industry felt it was so important that we actually put a project together, because the one thing about DPA is even when you're not using it, if you stop using it, you can still pick up chemical because it's cross-contaminant. So if you've used the chemical and you've had bins in cold rooms, you can get cross-contamination because now it's in the paint and it's in the cold room. So we did a project, we had a project running for 3 years where we did projects, we checked everything, cold rooms, pack house, packing bins, and to see where the risk was. Even if we stop using the chemical, can we have a risk of exceeding the MRL in the EU? And sorry, because we were doing the work, we were one of the countries, so this is somewhere where one can also, if you've done scientific work through Freshfall, because they were where we were doing this project, and Freshfall is based in the EU, the EU asked us to share our information with them. The other party that was also doing work like this was in Italy, but they had also a bigger problem because they used thermofogging, which goes more in the paint. So in this case, we were able to, not at that time, they delayed bringing the MRL down, so it gave us 2 more years to be able to have it, because they looked at our information and they said, okay, we'll give you time to see if the MRL can come down. And we extended that project again because we could see they were wanting to bring the MRL not from 0.1. It used to be 10, 5. Then it came down to 0.1, so we can't use it for the EU. But we were worried that we would still get contamination, because we found in some of the pack houses, if you took untreated fruit and you put it in there, you got levels that were over 0.05. So that was our concern. So we extended the project over the time to make sure that we were correct. So coming back to the regulations again, just to say, so if we're talking about the plant protection products regulation, there was a proposal that came into play in July 2006. This involves co-decision making procedure between the European Parliament and the Council. And it was finalized in January 2009. It was published in mid-2009, and it became applicable in 2010. And that's when some of these things started becoming problematic for us. So if we talk about this regulation, when does it apply? It's applicable to new substances. All new substances in the EU have to be evaluated through this process. But it's not applicable to substances that are already approved or substances under evaluation. It's only when their time expires, when they have to be re-registered, reauthorized, then it becomes relevant. So that's what the point I'm trying to make is it's applied to already approved substances only at the time of renewal, because that's the problem we're having now. Usually when a product is authorized in the EU for the first time, it's for 10 years. Probably similar here, same South Africa. Most renewals started happening after 2015, and that's when we started seeing some of these impacts on the chemicals. And why? Because at that time, the EU moved away from what they called a risk-based approach to using a hazard-based cutoff criteria. So in other words, any active ingredient that had any of the so-called cutoff criteria, if it has it, it's out. And many, you might have heard from some of the agrochemical companies. I was speaking to Syngenta at the Global Gap yesterday, and they made the comment of how this cutoff criteria has caused the loss of so many chemicals. So that's one of the reasons why, with that new legislation, the minute actives come up for renewal, that's when you start seeing a problem. And that's what I was trying to say, that if you want to start watching for actives that might come under the thing, then you must start looking. Which are the actives in the EU that are coming up to that period? Because it might mean it's going to be a product you lose. Okay, so why was it a problem? Because it's stricter than it was thought it was going to be by the European Parliament. There's a loss of 30 to 40 active substances, and that they're still ongoing. Some criteria still need to be fixed, like the endocrine disruptors. It results in withdrawal of the product following expiry if it doesn't meet the requirements, largely since 2015. There is this derogation clause that the member states are allowed to have, but I don't see it applied much in the EU. The substances need to be evaluated against these cutoff criteria, and the big one that's hanging over our head is the endocrine disruptors. We know the EU has been working on it. They've been working on a definition. They've been working on criteria, but we know it's going to have an impact on certain. The one that we're all scared of, I think, is mancozeb, because it's used for resistance management. And then there's another thing called the candidates for substitution, where they do comparative assessment, and there's a list of active substances which must be compared. So at a member state level, it doesn't mean they have to go out, but they have to see if they can find alternatives that are more safe. And while there was a list published in 2015 of candidates for substitution. What you see there are the actives that our industry was using, like tebuconazole is on there, mancozeb is on there. There are quite a lot of products on there. It's not intended to be a blacklist, but somehow it started being used as a blacklist. That's always the problem when you get lists like this in the EU. So if you look overall and you look at what impact this has had, many active substances have already been lost since the 1990s, and the impact of losing 2/3 is still left. And I mean, if you talk to the ag chem companies, you'll see there's not many dossiers coming through, new ones. So it is worrying. So this is an old slide, so I haven't got how it looks now, but you can see the downward trend. So there were quite a lot of reports done by various parties. The UK PSD evaluated the effect of these cut-off criteria, with the process indicating 286 substances were reviewed, and that was a higher figure which included endocrine disruptors. So if you just look, there were 3 different types of reports. There was the PSD EU, PSD UK, and ECPA, the European Crop Protection Association. Looking at insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, the higher side is including the endocrine disruptors. So that's kind of the percentage they were kind of predicting on the impact of these cut-off criteria. This is a more recent report. The Bryant Christie Group did a report which was in October 2017, where they looked at the estimation of potentially affected agricultural imports due to the hazard-based criteria in the EU regulation, which is particularly under this EU 1107 for authorization. And the important thing there is that Regulation 1107 provides that active substances used in crop protection products be assessed for potential hazards each time they come up for reauthorization. And if they have any of the cut-off criteria, then the EU MRLs will likely be revoked as well. So it impacts on the MRLs, but it also can mean a withdrawal of the chemical. And they determined in this latest one, there are up to 58 substances that could be affected. It's not a list saying it is, but that there were 58 of them that could be. And this is just then a list of some of those actives. I did have a look. Okay. Tebuconazole, for instance, is on there. Metalaxyl is on there. Mancozeb is on there. Now, it's not meant to say that it's going to, but it's likely they've got 2 to 3 cut-off criteria that will result in them going through that process. Yes. Well, it's just if certain activities, these are the sort of things that one looks at to say, what risk have we got for our chemicals being on there? So this is a list one can be aware of, but it's not the only thing. But I'll share the presentation with you so you'll be able to get it and see it. All right, so within our industry, once again, we have I have once a year a deciduous industry MRL work group with most of my key industry, and I also have more or less the same time a meeting with the crop protection advisory group. Our most recent one was in May, and then we would do an update on.
Maybe we can have just a little bit of questions.
Sure.
Amigos, de repente hemos pasado 2 partes, una primera parte de introducción, luego la parte gruesa de la exposición en la cual se mencionaron los requisitos y las fuentes de información donde se encuentran los residuos de plaguicidas y los requisitos de exportación. Si hubiera alguna duda o algo que aclarar o ampliar en este punto, quedaría abierta la posibilidad de hacerlo ahora. Enzo. El micro para Alfredo, por favor.
Where do I put it on?
Hola, buenos días a todos. Genaro, una consulta y una consulta también para la expositora. Es la regulación, la 1107-2009, es la que tenemos que revisar donde estarían los pesticidas que estarían propensos a una siguiente revisión. Por ejemplo, la última lista que usted acaba de poner donde hemos visto varios productos que usamos, por ejemplo, en la poscosecha, y hay algunos productos que usamos en campo, en cítricos, serían los que estarían en proceso de ser inspeccionados, ¿no?
When I get to the next part of my presentation, I'm just trying to give you some background so that you can understand what is driving the process. But you will see certain actives that I point out that are going through the process of reauthorization. And many of them don't get authorized. So, not all of them. And at the end of the presentation, I try to look at the list that ProCitrus uses to see if there are any actives that are coming up for that. So we can have a look again later.
Vamos a tener una revisión luego de los activos que van a ser probablemente en riesgo de salir, ¿no?, en la lista de productos autorizados.
Okay.
Alfredo.
Sí, y una consulta adicional que tal vez usted nos las comente más adelante. Hay productos que podrían ser no renovados. No ser renovados, ¿qué significa? Son retirados para no comercializarse o emplearse en Europa. Su LMR disminuye. Esa es una primera pregunta. Y la segunda pregunta, ¿qué pasa si ese producto acá en Perú está autorizado y que cuando nosotros lo usamos normalmente no deja residuos? Es decir, hay productos que se aplican y que no suelen dejar residuos porque son aplicados en la floración, pasa mucho tiempo y degrada completamente. El ser retirado de la Unión Europea, que no se comercialice, no se use allá, ¿también significa un tema prohibitivo acá en Perú?
It shouldn't be banned. That's why I hate the word banned. It is withdrawn for EU use. From an official regulatory point of view, if you can meet 0.01, even if that's been withdrawn, you can export. The problem is the retailers. There's some of them that don't want or won't allow you to use it. So at the end of my presentation, my one colleague works closely with the retailers. I try and summarize at the end to highlight, because it's a very important aspect, which are the retailers like Lidl, Aldi in Germany are examples. If it's not authorized, you can't use it. But it's not everyone. So I think I'm starting to get the feeling that the structure of my talk is good, because it'll leave you at the end to think about exactly what you're asking me. So the one question that the technical people asked me was, can you use the chemical if it's not registered in the EU? We have the same situation. Some of our actives can be used non-detectable, and for some of the market it's not a problem. But if you're exporting to Lidl or one of the German ones, it could be a problem. So legally it shouldn't be.
Clarísimo. Gracias.
Bueno, continuamos entonces. Lindi? Yes, we continue.
So my meeting in May, I don't know if you can see, but there are many, for instance, the EU. We always focus on what's happening in the EU. Developments with endocrine disruptors, perchlorate, looking at those products which have now been reviewed and not being reauthorized, so that we can start planning around it. And we also, in the first meeting, we always discuss some issues linked to the first version of our MRL list as well. This was a meeting, it was earlier, this meeting was in August of 2017. But you can see that eprodion, which is an important one for us, it was important, started becoming an issue there, and the neonicotinoids, imidacloprid, there were 3, imidacloprid, thiamotoxin, clothianidin, where you could see problems starting to come. So I want to be able to try and highlight what are the things one can look for to try and be proactive. Okay, so this is an example of one of the products, eprodion, which, how many of you know about the WTO notification process?
Conocemos acerca de las notificaciones de la Organización Mundial de Comercio acerca de la restricción de plaguicidas. ¿Alguien tiene alguna información al respecto?
Okay, so all countries that are signatories of the WTO, if you are changing your laws, like MRLs, like phytosanitary, the WTO notification process is the process that countries must inform trading partners. And if there is a notification, there's a 60-day comment period. Now, to be honest, on eprodion, we didn't comment. Because if a product is genotoxic or carcinogenic, and if you don't have the data to support that in the EU, you're wasting your time. Fortunately, we have perimethanol, we have fludioxanil, and the industry started moving away from eprodion. But what I'm saying is, if you look, this process was July 2017. And this was notifying first that because in the review, in the reauthorization of eprodion, because of the cutoff criteria that it was genotoxic, carcinogenic, it was not going to be renewed for approval. Now, that did not at that time affect the MRL. But one thing you must know is if something is a food safety risk, human concern, the MRL will go down. So this is an example that I wanted to use. Maybe you don't use eprodion, but you'll see the draft regulation for dropping the MRL to 0.01 it's now been voted on. So this is 1 year, and the chemical's gone. So if we didn't have alternatives, like perimethanol, fludeoxonil, we would have had a problem. So I'm trying to use chemicals to show you the examples. Okay, so I told you that because we saw it coming, we put a note in our industry information saying that because of pending reauthorization, non-authorization of eprediol, we warned the industry that the MRL might go down. This is also a WTO notification that came in August 2017, also to do with restriction of use of the 3 neonicotinoids that I talked about. And I know you use imidacloprid as well on your list. Once again, we also put a note, and to be honest, because we had 2 foliar products that we actually, I'll tell you now, but we put the same warning. The difference now is this is not a food safety risk. This has got to do with bee toxicity. So initially they restricted it to greenhouse use only. It shouldn't affect the MRL, but we're still unsure about that. So that's the difference between one that's carcinogenic and one that's not. Once again, this I told you now, it was in August 2017 that the WTO notification was notified. Here you can see the actual regulation that was published, saying that eprediol is not being renewed. Now, the thing is, when that happens, you don't know how long it will take for the MRL to drop. But one knows if it's food safety risk or human safety risk, it can drop quickly. I told you that for the imidacloprid, we had 2 foliar applications or trade names. We actually wrote a letter and we engaged with the agrochemical companies to cancel them. So they still can be used as soil applications, but not foliar, because of the risk. DPA again, we were asked by the EU Commission, because they knew that we had done the work in November last year, to again share information with them. And we highlighted to them that on the basis that we were still picking up monitoring residue, not a lot, but we were still picking up between 0.05 and 0.1. We wanted to stay at 0.1. But unfortunately, even us and the Italian party that did it, when you've got 28 member states that don't want it, it's gone down. It's going down in May next year. So at least we were able to stretch the time that it was available, but it didn't stop the process. Okay, so we have more than one of these meetings a year. And this particular meeting was a meeting with the Crop Protection Advisory Group. To to focus on looking and identifying critical gaps. So because we were losing some chemicals, where were the gaps that we needed to get? So we looked at the pests, the diseases, we looked at the management control options, we looked at where we needed critical need registrations. So it was like a strategy session to try and identify where we're going to have problems. So now I'm going to try and flag some of the things that I was asked on certain dossiers. Because we are members of SHAFE, Freshfell is the secretariat of SHAFE. They are based in Brussels, and they are often involved very directly with the EU Commission. In fact, I have had meetings in Brussels with the Commission together with Freshfell. So they are a valuable source of information on some of the changing legislation. So in the meeting that they had in about May this year, they shared some of the latest developments regarding some of the dossiers on the MRLs. So you were asking about the phosphonates. Now, I know that citrus has quite a high MRL, but for us, there was a temporary MRL until 2016, but it went back down to 2 milligrams per kilogram for stone fruit. On table grapes, we have a higher MRL. And on pome fruit, we had 75. And for many of the smaller crops, blueberries, mango, they were in the same situation. Now, for blueberries, the US worked on an import tolerance, which has now become effective. Now, the problem we have with phosphatile or phosphonates, I didn't include it here, but we put out what we call a cautionary note. Because with fertilizers, it might be the same here in Peru. The legislation in South Africa was that they don't have to disclose if they're phosphonates. So I talk about unintended consequence. Not illegal because it was registered, but if the producer doesn't know it's in there, then if you export to Germany, even for apples with a 75 MRL, if they knew they were going to have 3 residues, and there's a surprise package of phosphonates, then the product's rejected. So that is one angle that we've worked closely with our registrar's office, and they have revised some of the legislation so that parties registering fertilizers and adjuvants are another. In South Africa, you don't know that phosphonates are in adjuvants. And one of the ones that was the problem for us was biological products. The one incidence where we had the highest exceedance was linked to a microbiological product. So you don't think it will be a problem. So we put out a cautionary note, which I can share with you. It might be different in your industry, but it helped us to manage the risk. because it made people aware of the possible problem. And some of them tested then before using. And now from the registrar's side, they actually ask parties to do residue testing if they've added phosphonates in a new agrochemical product. So the one thing I wanted to point out here is phosphatile shouldn't be a food safety problem. Shouldn't. It occurs naturally. In many crops, they actually have natural levels. And in fact, in the most recent legislation, they want to increase the MRL of 75 to 150 on pome fruit, and from 2 to 50 on peaches, nectarines, and on nuts, much higher, because 500 ppm because of the import tolerance work done by the US. So I just gave a little bit of a timeline here because the vote was taken in February 2018 for this legislation to be accepted. And there's 2 committees that are responsible for chemical issues in the EU. It's the EU Standing Committee for Pesticide Residues, which is where most of the issues around MRLs would be discussed. And also the EU Standing Committee for Legislation. And that's where the authorization issues get discussed under 1107. So usually if a vote is taken at a meeting, it's roughly 3 to 4 months for the draft regulation to be published into an implementing regulation. Because the European Parliament must scrutinize it, they must translate it into 28 languages. So even though the vote was taken in February, approximately June, July, we expected that the thing would enter into force. But because of the EU holidays, which happens August, we're still waiting. But that's not the main thing that I wanted to say. The other thing that I watch is the European Food Safety Reasoned Opinions. Now, in the EU, the EFSA, the European Food Safety, they are the risk assessors. So when a reasoned opinion comes out for an active, that is used then to take the process forward. And why I highlighted this section, because we actually have a phosphonates focus group, and we're trying to still get MRLs increased in South Africa for phosphonates. But I highlighted this because from this most recent reasoned opinion, it was found that, and I'll read the sentence. In contrast, and considering the ARFD of 1 milligram per kilogram for phosphonic acid, there's an exceedance of the ARFD was identified. And for numerous commodities, and this means that the proposed MRLs under Article 12, which is the revision of the MRLs, is now going to have to be reviewed and revised because there's now a concern about the acute reference dose. So this is sometimes where you see the EU, 1 minute they're up, now that looks like it's going to go down again. That's why I put the question mark there. Because one process is still happening, and now they've identified a potential ARFD risk. So it's one of those that's a question mark at the moment. I don't think we'll lose MRLs, but it's certainly going to have an impact on some of the commodities, reducing it. I can't say which ones. This reasoned opinion is this thick. You can read it, and it will give you indications. So I'm flagging it because it looks like it's going to impact on the phosphatile. Again, using DPA as an example, which is now the one that was not authorized many years ago. There was a vote taken in June 2018 at the Standing Committee Residues on the draft regulation that I told you that's going to drop from 0.1 to 0.05. It will take 3 to 4 months approximately for the scrutiny and for drafting the implementing regulation. And we expected publication approximately September, October 2018 to the reduced MRL. But when a MRL is going down, then from the date of publication, 6 months after, it enters into force. So that's why I'm trying to give you an example of knowing how you watch these things. So here was the draft that was voted on, and the WTO notification that warned trading partners we're going to drop it with a 60-day comment period. And here is the published regulation, which was published on the 12th of October, and it will apply from the 1st of May 2019, just at the start of our next palm fruit season. And I'll come back to that because we've done some extra risk management, because now we're worried that the labs are not testing good. Even if we're not using it, if they've got different results, we might exceed 0.05. So I'll come back to that. Okay, so Epidion, once again, the discussions on the reduction of the MRL have been going on since 2018. And actually, to be honest with Epidion, some of the member states didn't agree, because obviously some needed it more than others. So they took quite a while to get to a decision on the vote. But once again, in June, they took a vote. And so we are aware that it's an issue on the ARFD. For us, we've lost the chemical. We're not worrying about it. But it's just to give you a feeling, if something is a genotoxic, mutagenic, carcinogenic, the process is quick. Then you also asked about the chlorate. The chlorate discussion has been going on for a while. In fact, our industry also did a project to do some testing in South Africa, because we did notice that some of the reference labs had picked up on pears and apples, some levels, and so we were worried. So where are we with chlorate? The EU Commission relaunched the discussions on chlorate at the end of 2017, the beginning of 2018, based on the proposal of 2015. The European Commission decided not to launch another official process to collect analytical data, because that 2015 process allowed data to be shared so that they could see what levels were being picked up. So the discussions that are happening now is based on the data, the monitoring data that was collected in 2015 from the different member states and industries. And Freshvale collected a lot of monitoring data and sent it to the EU Commission in January 2018. And they expressed concern regarding the proposal of 2015 in a position paper. They're very good about, when necessary, putting a position paper forward. Meanwhile, the process, there's ongoing consultation on chlorate level in drinking water. The proposal for chlorate at the moment, it's not published yet, is 0.25 milligrams per liter. And the current level, the WHO recommendation is 0.7 milligram per kilogram. Now, when we did some testing, we picked up to 0.05. And the first proposal that was put forward in 2015 was talking about 0.02 on palm fruit, which was very worrying to us. So the timeline at the moment is it's roughly 2 to 3 years till the EU levels will be adopted. So that's where things are at the moment. Great. So just some developments on various dossiers and authorizations. This is not a product you're using, but it is one of the ones that our industry considered as an alternative to mancozeb. And why I'm highlighting it is because it's one of those products, surprisingly enough, that came up when it was reauthorized for amended conditions of authorization. And they were wanting to restrict it to non-edible crops. But the reason I put it here is they've amended the conditions, but for some reason, the latest legislation has allowed it to be extended for 2 years. So this is not yet applicable, so we can still use it. But it's definitely a warning that there might be something with this chemical. So you sometimes have that. And these are just examples, again, that I want to show you, because over the last year, I've noticed an increase in the number of non-renewals of products. So as more products come up for reauthorization, we're getting more products not authorized. Phenamidone, pymetrozine, these are all examples. So that's something I'm definitely seeing. There's more products that are coming to non-renewal stage. We hope that not all of them have the MRLs reduced. Neonicotinoids. Okay, so after the WTO notifications I shared with you already, there was a proposed full ban on the use of imidacloprid, thiamotoxin, and clothianidin in the EU, unless it's grown in greenhouses. And also there was an EFSA opinion on bumblebees and solitary and honeybee issues. There was a vote on the 27th of April on the draft proposal. And as you can see there, we as third countries, there should not be a problem for us to use it. We don't use it the same as the EU. But we are experiencing some of the private standards that putting pressure that we can't use it. And the other warning is, it does appear that it's quite persistent in certain crops. Some of my blueberry colleagues haven't applied imidacloprid, but they've grown in soils where it was applied, and they're picking up residues. So it's quite persistent. So at this stage, the worrying part for me is that it says after this, the EU member states will start discussions on possible MRL changes. And also saying that it's expected to be reduced for crops that are grown outdoors in the EU. And it will still be possible to set import tolerances for neonicotinoids. But we know there'll be pressure from some of the private standard parties. So I think if you like us, mostly, if the MRL is about 0.05, it's a soil application, one expects to be okay. But coming back to the earlier question, it depends if you pick up problems from the retailers that you're exporting to. It's not yet changed, but that is where things are. Then just because there are other neonicotinoids, and one of them is on your list, acetamiprid. So obviously everyone was asking, what about, in our case we also use thiocloprid on palm fruit. So acetamiprid was evaluated, and they find that it has a low risk to bees, unlike the others. So a ban or further restrictions of the substance is therefore not legally appropriate. But I am aware that acetamiprid it's not a problem to bees, but it does appear the MRL may go down in certain crops. We're not there yet, but there's definitely writing on the wall. Thiocloprid is that's the fifth neonicotinoid. It's one of those products that's been identified as a candidate for substitution based on endocrine disrupting properties. And in this case, candidates for substitution are pesticides for which I already said national authorities or member states need to carry out an assessment to establish whether there's more favorable alternatives to use. So at the moment, nothing's happening with it, but it's quite an important one for us on our palm fruit. So we're watching that space.
Bueno amigos, en este segundo bloque hay algunas precisiones adicionales sobre los productos que estamos viendo. Quizás en este momento podemos ya pasar a un pequeño break, ¿sí? De 20 minutos. El break se encuentra afuera. De igual manera, por favor, vayan formulando algunas preguntas o dudas que tuvieran al respecto para tenerlas listas y continuar con la charla. Bien, gracias.